They say keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but what happens when your friends are the enemy? Before first light on the Florida-Georgia line, a young father slides an aluminum John boat off the trailer and points it toward Lake Seminole. With a familiar hunter's checklist in his head, get tucked into the stump field before the sky turns, drop the decoys, take a quick morning shoot, then race home to shower, grab flowers, and make it to a 6th wedding anniversary dinner like nothing in the world could go wrong. But by late afternoon, Mike Williams never makes it home. The phone calls start with everyone looking for Mike. He would never in a million years miss his anniversary dinner. But where on earth could he be? Welcome to That's My Opinion, where we break down the biggest stories, uncover hidden truths, and explore why they matter. I'm Bacon Bearzz, and today we're diving into a case that starts with a missing hunter and ends with a decades-long trail of secrets, manipulation, and murder. If you're into deep dives, hit subscribe and tap the bell so that you don't miss anything. This video is for conversational purposes only. Do your own research and form your own opinions because this one's mine, and let's get started. Tallahassee, Florida is one of those towns that feels small no matter how big it gets. It's really like a big neighborhood. The kind of place where people don't just know each other. They've grown up together. They've gone to the same church. They dated the same few people, married their high school sweethearts, and stayed close to family. And that's exactly the kind of place Mike Williams grew up in. Mike was the reliable one. Born in 1969, raised by a single mom, Cheryl, who worked hard and made sure that her boy did not go without. He wasn't flashy, but he was solid, the type to play football, work hard in school, and never cause any trouble. By the time he hit adulthood, Mike had earned a degree from Florida State and landed a respectable job with the state as a property appraiser. And he didn't just clock in and out, he rose through the ranks quickly. People liked him. His boss, Clay Ketchum, later told reporters he was the kind of guy who could have gone all the way to running the department. He had that much potential. And then there was Denise Merrill. She was the kind of girl everyone knew. Sweet, quiet, very pretty, very polished, raised in a devout Baptist family, heavy into modesty, image, and doing things that would be considered here the right way. Denise and Mike met in high school at North Florida Christian, where church, football, and conservative values were the foundation of everything. They started dating young, and they just never stopped. However, Mike and Denise weren't the only ones locked into that kind of lifelong path. Their two best friends, Brian Winchester and Kathy Aldridge, were right there with them. Same high school, same church, same friend group. Brian was Mike's closest friend. They were like brothers. A jokester, a little more wild, but still grounded in that Southern church boy upbringing. Kathy was also one of Denise's best friends. And wouldn't you know it, they got married too. The four of them were absolutely inseparable. Trips together, hunting and fishing weekends, dinner parties, and church on Sundays. They didn't just grow up together, they grew into adulthood in sync. But here's something important that you need to understand about this group before we move forward. In their early 20s, before the kids came along, they partied hard. Not in a super scandalous sort of way, just in that we finally have freedom and we're pushing every button we weren't allowed to growing up kind of way. Drinking, dancing, experimenting. And for kids raised in a strict Christian household, that kind of rebellion doesn't come without maybe some baggage. For some, like Kathy, there was guilt. For others, there was curiosity. And for a few, like Brian and Denise, there was a sense of, could there be more? But for Mike and Kathy, the quieter ones, what they really wanted was to settle down. They wanted to start families and step fully into the life that they had always been taught to build, and that's exactly what they did. Both couples settled into adult life around the same time. Mike and Denise got married in 1994, Brian and Kathy right behind them. They bought houses, they built careers, they started families. Mike and Denise welcomed their daughter Ainsley in 1999, and Mike, he absolutely adored being a dad. He'd gotten his dream. Hunting in the early morning, dad duties for the rest of the day. He was completely enamored with this baby. She was the center of his world. Brian and Kathy would also have a son of their own named Stafford. So not only would these couples grow up together, but so would their children. Everything was absolutely picture perfect until December of 2000. December 16th, 2000. It was just before sunrise. Mike Williams wakes up early, he kisses Denise goodbye, and tells her he's going duck hunting. It was not unusual. It was duck season, and Mike was a lifelong hunter, and it was his peace, his routine. But this trip was supposed to be quick. He'd already made dinner reservations with Denise to celebrate their 6th wedding anniversary. He promised he'd be home in time to shower, grab flowers, and take her out for the night. Mike loaded up his aluminum John boat, his decoys, his waders, his gear, everything a duck hunter would need, and he drove out to the lake. He was right on the Florida-Georgia line, a huge, dark, tangled place full of stumps, gator grass, and fog. After that, nothing. No more calls, no returns. And by mid-morning, when Denise hadn't heard from him, she started calling around. But Mike's mother, Cheryl, was immediately panicked. She knew something was wrong, and she started calling hospitals. Mike's boss, Clay Ketchum, actually drove himself to the lake to look for him. By that afternoon, they found his truck and boat trailer parked at the ramp, but no sign of Mike. And then they spotted the boat. Mike's Little John boat was floating about 225 feet from the landing, caught up in some reeds. But here's what stood out immediately. The engine was not running. The gas tank was still completely full, and the kill switch was still attached, which meant the engine should have cut off if he fell. When you really stop to look at all the facts, the whole situation just doesn't make any sense. If Mike had fallen overboard while wearing the kill switch lanyard, like every experienced duck hunter should do for safety purposes, then the engine would have shut off immediately. That's what the switch is for. But when they found the boat, the kill switch was still attached to the boat, not on Mike. So that tells us that he wasn't wearing it, which if he fell without wearing the kill switch clip, then the boat should have just kept running in circles until it ran out of gas. That's what a lot of boats do. They spin out or they drift until they run dry. But this one was sitting there in the reeds, perfectly still, full tank of gas, and the engine was off. So the question becomes, how did the boat get like that? Search teams hit the lake hard. They used airboats, helicopters, divers, and cadaver dogs. And if you've ever been to Lake Seminole, you'll know how hard that would have been. It's a dangerous place to search. Stumps under the water, mud that swallows your boots whole, visibility near zero. And they went every day for weeks. Cheryl, Mike's mom, was there constantly. Now, people immediately started whispering, it's Florida, what about the alligators? But it was December, and in Florida winter, gators do not eat. They don't move much at all, to be honest with you. They go into a slow, sluggish hiding. And let's say one had gotten to Mike. The way that the search was handled, something, anything should have turned up. A boot, a wader, something. But nothing did. The official explanation was, quote, accidental drowning. They said Mike probably fell out of the boat while setting decoys and his body got pulled under by gators or trapped in the mud, and it was tragic and it was quiet. No foul play was suspected. Case closed. Except Cheryl didn't buy it. She refused to believe that her son just vanished. She started pushing the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, the Leon County Sheriff's Office, and anybody who would listen. People in the town thought she was absolutely crazy. She printed out flyers, she wrote letters, she took out a classified ad in the Tallahassee Democrat begging for information. She even wrote a letter to the governor. She believed that from the very beginning that something other than drowning had happened to her son, but nobody wanted to hear it. What's wild is that Denise, his wife, wasn't pushing for anything. She wasn't leading searches. She wasn't at searches. She wasn't doing press. She planned a memorial service just 30 days after Mike disappeared. 1 month. And then she tried to declare him dead not long after that. But there was something about Denise's behavior that just did not sit right with Cheryl. She said Denise made it clear she didn't want to hear Mike's name again. She didn't want to see his photo in the paper and didn't want the case brought up at all. Cheryl even testified that Denise gave the family an ultimatum. Stop pushing for an investigation or she would completely shut them off. And that included access to Mike's daughter, Ansley. And to Cheryl, that didn't sound like grief. It sounded like someone who wanted the whole thing buried. And I agree. Denise wasn't calling the news, she wasn't organizing searches, and she wasn't even asking questions. Cheryl said it actually felt like Denise was relieved while everyone else is grieving, which is such a disturbing thought. Like you lose your son and somebody else is showing like a sense of relief. Ugh, Florida law usually requires 5 years to pass before someone can be declared legally dead without a body, unless a court agrees that there's clear evidence of specific peril of death. A tragic boating accident could count, especially if the gear is left behind. And that's exactly what Denise leaned on when she petitioned for Mike's death certificate less than a year after he vanished. Months after Mike went missing, a few of his personal items just magically turned up, floating in an area of Lake Seminole that had already been searched. This included his waders, a hunting jacket, a flashlight, and even his hunting license. The gear was oddly preserved, and it hadn't been spotted during previous searches. And it conveniently showed up just in time to help Denise file her paperwork. So with no body, no injuries, no blood, just a few conveniently found items, the court agreed that Mike had likely drowned and issued the death certificate. Denise collected nearly $1.75 million in life insurance. And as far as the state was concerned, the case was closed. Oh, and by the way, just if you were wondering where they got that life insurance from, the policies were sold to Mike and Denise from Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. So while Cheryl Williams was out here fighting to keep Mike's name alive, writing letters, buying newspaper ads, asking questions, something very different was happening behind closed doors. Denise Williams, a grieving widow who just collected nearly $2 million in life insurance, wasn't pulling away from everyone. No, she was getting closer to Brian Winchester, her husband's best friend, the same guy who sold Mike the policies in the first place. The same guy who was married to Denise's best friend, Kathy. I mean, I guess if you're going to do it big, right? And nobody knew it yet, but Denise and Brian had already been having an affair, one that started years before Mike disappeared. Brian and Denise were having a full-blown affair. And they could, I don't know, maybe get a divorce, but nobody gets divorces in these stories. I don't know why. But Denise was still deeply rooted in her church and her faith. And in her mind, divorce was something that God would frown upon. But apparently adultery and murder were way more acceptable. Denise didn't want to split custody of her daughter. She didn't want the embarrassment of a divorce in a conservative Baptist community. And she didn't want people to know she was cheating. And you want to know something? A great way to avoid all of this would just be to, not do it. Just don't do it. However, instead of walking away from their marriages, they started planning a way out. And for Mike, that meant he was in the way. Once Mike was declared legally dead, Brian and Denise were in the clear. The insurance had paid out. The case was closed, and for the next several years, they kept everything under wraps. Publicly, Denise was still a grieving widow, barely. Privately, she and Brian were slowly pulling their lives together like nothing ever happened. They would meet in secret, they would take vacations, but they acted like this was just a normal chapter, and nobody on the outside knew a thing. Even Kathy, Brian's wife at the time. She would later testify that she had no idea. She suspected that things were off, but she never imagined her husband was helping cover up a murder. Not until it was way too late. And guilt is strange. It shows up in little ways. Sometimes it's panic, sometimes it's control. And for Brian Winchester, it started to eat at him. Not just about what he had done, but what Denise was becoming. By the time Brian and Denise would go on to get married in 2005, it wasn't some fairy tale ending. It was tense. They were still hiding things. Denise was trying to keep the past buried, and Brian is spiraling. He became paranoid, controlling, possessive. He was terrified that Denise would leave him. And they say you lose him how you got him. But I think he was even more terrified that she would go to the police. However, when Denise finally did leave him in 2012, Brian did not take this well. But let's pivot for a second and talk about the parallels between Brian's marriage to Kathy and his marriage to Denise. Because Brian was not necessarily any different with Denise than he was with Kathy. When Brian was married to Kathy, she was the quiet, loyal, steady one. She wanted a stable home, wanted to build a life, have a family, just like Mike. And just like Denise, Brian got bored. He got restless. He started looking outside the marriage, but instead of just being honest or leaving, he started sneaking around, lying, controlling things behind the scenes. And that marriage fell apart because Brian couldn't be content with an ordinary life, even though it's exactly the life that he claimed to want. But then you fast forward and he finally marries Denise, the woman he supposedly risked everything for. And what happens? The same thing. He becomes possessive, obsessed, controlling. He monitors her every move. He spirals when she tries to leave. So you really have to ask, did Brian ever really want a relationship, or did he just want control? Because no matter who he was with, Brian was never a good partner himself. Now, we haven't really talked about Kathy in this whole thing, but she is so important to this because Kathy wasn't just a background character in this story. She had been married to Brian. And as everything started to unravel, her marriage, her friendship, her sense of reality, she quietly started putting the pieces together. Kathy had talked to Cheryl, Mike's mom. She saw how quickly Brian and Denise's relationship moved after Mike disappeared. She saw how Denise never really acted like a grieving widow. And deep down, she started to suspect that Brian and Denise might have had something to do with Mike's disappearance. And instead of turning away, Kathy made a choice. While Denise and Brian were building the shiny little post-tragedy life, Kathy, the soft-spoken suburban mom, started working with the police. She wore a wire, she went undercover, and she put herself right back into the orbit of the woman who destroyed her marriage just to get close enough to find the cracks. Because when Denise's marriage to Brian started to fall apart, guess who she confided in? Kathy. And nobody could understand what it was like to be married to Brian better than she could. Kathy used her own betrayal to get justice for Mike. Chef's kiss. Now at this point, Brian can feel the walls closing in. Even though police hadn't approached him directly, he was unraveling. And a huge part of that was Cheryl, Mike's mom, who never gave up. This woman went full force, printing up missing posters and stapling them to every tree and every pole along the route from Brian's house to his job, so that every day he had to drive past Mike's face. Hell yeah, Cheryl. Now on the flip side, Brian's own mother was reportedly going around ripping the posters down. You're a terrible human being. But with all that pressure building, the lies, the guilt, the cold stares in the community, Brian is just erratic. And after Denise finally left him, he completely lost control. He starts stalking her, popping up at her job, sending threatening messages. He is obsessed. He couldn't believe she was just walking away clean while he was carrying the full weight of what they had done. August 5th, 2016, a regular Friday morning in Tallahassee. Denise is getting into her car and starts driving. Brian suddenly appears with a gun, crawling from the back seat where he had been hiding, which, my nightmare, and he points a loaded gun at her. However, Brian didn't just bring a gun. No. He brought gloves, a tarp, bleach, deodorizing spray, a tool for disabling car locks, a bottle of water, dark clothes, and printed instructions for Denise. The plan was murder-suicide. But Denise stayed calm. She talked him down. She reminded him about her daughter. She reminded him about his son, about how much damage this would cause, about the life that he would throw away. And it worked. He finally let her go. And the moment she felt she was safe, she went straight to the police. And she told them absolutely everything that had happened. But the thing is, law enforcement had already started putting the bigger picture together. And by this point, they had strongly suspected that both Brian and Denise had been involved in whatever happened to Mike all those years ago. So while they had Denise in the interview room, they pressed her. They kept circling back to the past, her marriage, her choices, and the way she responded. It was weird.
We were hoping one day that either Brian or you maybe could fill in some of the gaps there, pull in a piece of the puzzle.
Right, but I guess right now I need to focus on this and what happened this morning, and I want to get this restraining order done by 5 o'clock, and I want me and my daughter to be safe, and that's what I'm focused on.
There's no doubt that Brian's going to be located and put in jail.
But I guess what I'm saying is about the Mike situation that you want to talk about. I don't want to talk about this right now.
Would you talk about it later?
I don't want to talk about this right now. I want to get this settled first.
This is settled.
It's not settled to me, though. I have not gone down. I have not filed the restraining order, and that's what is pressing on me so bad. So I understand that you want to talk about this, but this is what I want to do. This is what has to be done.
Yeah,
Today.
You got some time. We're almost done. All right. When you know why it's so important to talk to you about Mike. This was your husband. He simply vanished. Hopefully you still have an interest in this.
Well, again, this is my priority right now, and I'm not comfortable talking about this right now. I've had an unbelievable day, and it's just all too much right now. I really want to focus on it.
Her answers were cold. She kept saying she wasn't talking about that. However, if Denise wasn't going to give them anything, Brian was now arrested for the kidnapping, and investigators finally had leverage. They finally had a way to push him. And under the pressure, Brian cracks. And that's when he tells them what really happened to Mike. He told them everything: the affair, the insurance policies, the plan, how they killed Mike. And after all those years, after the searches, the newspaper ads, the prayers, Cheryl Williams finally got the answer that she already knew in her gut, that her son hadn't drowned. He had been murdered by his best friend and the love of his life. As a side note, which this is a totally wild side note, Brian Winchester is in jail and he makes friends with another name you might know, a man named Wade Wilson. Yeah, when I tell you I was shocked, if you don't know who Wade Wilson is, he went viral on social media because he went on a small killing spree. And then the TikTok girlies were like, oh my God, he's so hot. Yuck. If you guys want a long form video on Wade, let me know. I'll put it on the list. Anyways, Wade Wilson is on his way out of prison, and Brian knows this. And he told him that he had a job for him, and all he had to do was call the phone number that Brian had given him. So he gets out of jail and he calls the phone number and meets a man in the parking lot who gives him an envelope with $20,000 in it. And that was to, quote, take care of Denise. Now, nobody knows what that means, but I have my guesses. Wade backs out. But he did say that the man who offered him the money bore a striking resemblance to Brian Winchester. So do with that information what you will. But after everything, after Brian spilled it all, after years of secrets and grief and suspicion, Denise was finally arrested. And the timing, these poor children. She was taken into custody on her daughter's birthday, and the official charges were conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, accessory after the fact to first-degree murder, and insurance fraud. Because remember, Denise collected over $1.75 million in life insurance money after Mike disappeared. Policies that Brian Winchester, her then lover and eventual husband, had helped set up. Prosecutors argued that the whole thing was a plot. She and Brian didn't want divorces, so instead they made Mike disappear. They claimed Denise knew the plan, benefited from it, and helped keep the secret for nearly 2 decades. And I have to ask, when was Kathy going to be next? Like, was Kathy also not on this list? However, Denise was never charged with murder. Brian, the one who admitted to killing Mike with his own hands, got full immunity for testifying against her. And just like that, no one ever faced a murder conviction. Mike Williams never got the full justice he deserved. But the question was, what did happen to Mike Williams? And the truth is so terrifying. It's so terrifying. On the morning of December 16th of 2000, Brian Winchester and Mike Williams went duck hunting at Lake Seminole in Jackson County, Florida. This was not unusual. They had been best friends since high school, and both were avid hunters. Mike was going out with his best friend to spend some time. According to Brian's full confession, the two launched Mike's small aluminum john boat into the lake before sunrise. Brian's plan was to stage an accidental drowning, and he expected that when Mike fell into the cold water wearing his heavy waders and jacket, that he would sink and drown, making it look like a tragic accident. Brian said that he got Mike to stand up in the boat to adjust the decoys, and that's when he pushed him into the water. And Mike struggled in the water while Brian just sat there in the boat watching. But Mike didn't drown. Instead, he managed to get out of the waders and swim to a nearby tree stump. He clung to it, shivering in the cold December water, and he pled with Brian for help. Brian panicked, and he circled his boat around Mike to get closer to him, and he pulled out a shotgun, and he aimed it at Mike, and he shot him in the face Once Mike was dead, Brian loaded his body into his vehicle and drove to Carr Lake, where he dug a hole with a shovel and buried Mike's body near the edge of the water. Then he drove back to Lake Seminole, staged the boat scene, left the shotgun, decoys, and gear in place, and went on to play the part of the grieving best friend. This is how Mike Williams died. When Brian told the story about how he brutally killed his best friend, the entire courtroom cried. Everyone in the room sobbed, except for Denise. At sentencing, the judge handed her a life sentence for conspiracy plus 30 years for accessory and 5 years for the fraud charge. And these were all to run concurrently. But in 2020, a Florida appeals court overturned the most serious charge, the conspiracy conviction, citing insufficient evidence that Denise actively helped plan the murder in advance. As a result, her life sentence was vacated, but her convictions for insurance fraud and being an accessory after the fact were upheld. That left her with a reduced sentence of 30 years in prison, which she is currently serving. There's a lot of people who also think that Brian didn't do this himself. So I need to know what you think. Did Denise plan it from the beginning? Or was Brian the one pulling the strings? Do you think Denise was there when Mike was killed? And why, after everything, does it still feel like Mike never actually got the justice that he deserved? Leave your theories in the comments, hit subscribe, and tap the bell if you want more deep dives. A full source list is down in the description. Transparency, always. I'm Bearzz, and that's my opinion.